Well, how good is this? It's a perfect spot to sit down with a cool drink and relax. The best part about it is you've built this deck yourself and you've saved a heap of money. A couple of things you need to consider is the type of timber to use. In this case, we've used hardwood. The alternate option was to use softwood, but in my opinion, hardwood with its resilience and density is going to keep this deck looking beautiful for a long time. There are two types of decks, freestanding and attached. This freestanding deck is only 600 millimetres above the ground. Therefore, we don't need to have a handrail, but you'll need to check with your local council because if your deck is any higher than that, you'll probably need to have a handrail. When you're building a deck like this one, the size of the post, bearers and joist and also the spans need to meet the minimum Australian standards. This information is available from your local council, but do yourself a favour and get all the required information. It'll just save you a lot of hassle later on. So where do you start? Well, the best place to start is to draw a detailed plan. That plan should include the overall dimensions of the deck, the height off the ground, the positions of the footings and the size of the footings. Now your deck needs to be supported on a footing. You can't just sit the post directly on the soil. When it moves and contracts, your deck will end up falling over. Now the size of your footing is regulated by your local council. They'll determine the size by the soil type in your local area. We've set up some simple profiles here. We've knocked 2 pegs into the ground with a scrap piece of timber. This lets us keep the string line up off the ground and it allows us to adjust the angle. We need to make sure that this corner is exactly square. The simplest way to do that is with the old 3-4-5 method. If I measure 900 millimetres from the corner along this string line, 1200 millimetres along that string line, the length should be 1500 millimetres from that point to this point. If it is, that corner is exactly 90 degrees. Now when we've started setting out, we've used the back wall of the house as a reference point. We've ran this string line at 90 degrees to the wall and we started to set this one that will be parallel to the house and 90 degrees to this string line. What I'm doing here is marking the location of the first footing. I've got my old mate Frank here to give me a hand with the tape. We're spacing our footings at 1200 millimetre centres. That suits our size of timber. We're ready for our excavation stage now. We've started cleaning up as much of the mess as we can. But looking at the size of these rocks, we've got a little bit more work to do. One thing you need to keep in mind is make sure the land falls away from the house. Any water that penetrates through the deck and leans back to the house will cause a lot of water problems later on. You'll probably need to use a crowbar just to loosen the soil. Frank's using a clamshell post hole digger here. Another type is this hand auger. But if the going gets really tough, you could hire a petrol driven auger. But be careful, when they bite in the clay, you could end up over the fence. To calculate the quantities of concrete you need for your footings, you need 3 dimensions. You need the width, the length and the depth. Now depending on what sort of machinery you use to dig the holes will determine what formula you use. Now if you use an auger, you'll be left with a cylindrical hole and you'll need to use pi r squared times the depth times the number of holes you have. If you use a square mouth shovel, it'll be the width times the length by the depth and times that by the amount of holes that you have. For example, if your total equaled 3.1 metres, you'll need to order 3.2 as concrete is delivered in 0.2 cubic metre increments. The last thing you want to do is be 1 shovelful short. Personally, I think having the concrete delivered is a much better option. If you mix it yourself, it takes forever, you wear yourself out and you don't even save that much money. There are 2 types of post supports. One that fits into the wet concrete and the other sits on top of a dry footing. This type sits into the wet concrete, but they need to be braced and supported in position while you pour the footing. A lot more work and very difficult to achieve. The other type, and the type that I prefer, is simply bolted to the top of a dry footing. We're demonstrating a freestanding deck. If yours was an attached one, you would have a ledger attached to the wall parallel and at the same height as this bearer. If it was a brick wall, it would be attached with a dynabolt, but if it was a timber stud, you'd use a coach screw. This one's attached, and all the parts I need to show you are down there, so I'll come down with you. This deck is attached by this crucial part called the ledger. The ledger is attached to the masonry wall via this dynobolt. Now the principle of the dynobolt is when you tighten this nut, it slides up the sleeve and that expands into the concrete.